So in the previous lecture, we looked into how we can extract our data from image sequences regarding our parameters of interest and basically convert them into time series signals. So we saw that from an image sequence of a flame that is propagating in a channel, we were able to come up with a time series variation of the chemiluminescence intensity and the position variation of the flame. So similar time series profiles can be obtained for all the other parameters that we are interested in. Such time series signals can also be directly obtained if we use sensors. Say if we use a pressure sensor or a thermocouple, we directly get time series variation of these parameters at a specific location in the flow field. Now we are going to look into how we can process this time series data, how we can represent them in easier formats so that we can make sense out of them easily. So one of the most commonly used technique is to use Fourier series representation of time series signals. So this can be viewed of as a coordinate transformation so that interpretation of a time series signals become easier. So, so before moving on to the Fourier series representation of a time series signal, we need to walk through a few definitions. So we'll start off with the inner product of the functions. Say we have two time series signals f of t and g of t that is defined in the domain a comma b. Then we can define the inner product between the two functions as an integral that runs from a to b, which is basically the size of the domain f of t g of t dt. So we can think of this as basically a vector product equivalent in the function space. To understand this, let us look at an example in the vector space itself. Say we have two vectors f and g. What we are essentially doing here is that we are taking the summation of the element wise product across the entire length of the vector. So basically that is nothing but the dot product of the two vectors f and g. So basically inner product is essentially the equivalent of a dot product in the function space. So once we have this inner product defined, we can define another important parameter, which is the L2 norm of a function. L2 norm of the function f of t, here it is defined as the square root of the inner product with itself, and that is basically nothing but the square root of the integral from a to b of f of t whole square dt. So this is actually used to normalize the function, as we'll see in one of our future slides. Now to bring about the idea of a Fourier series representation of a time series signal, we'll again look into an example from our vector algebra. Say suppose I have a function f that is defined in a vector space, and in that vector space I have two sets of basis functions x comma y and u comma v. I'm not going to get into the definitions of what basis vectors are. You can basically think of them as vectors which cannot be represented as a linear combination of one another. Basically that means that I cannot express x in terms of y, and a linear combination of this x and y can basically span the entire vector space. So they are so vector sets that have this property, they are called as basis vectors. So now in this vector space I have two sets of basis vectors x comma y and u comma v. Now this function f can basically be expressed in terms of both x comma y and u comma v, and the way we do it is in this format. So basically f can be expressed as f dot x cap in the x cap direction plus f dot y cap in the y cap direction. Here this x cap and y cap are basically nothing but unit vectors along the x and y directions, that's it. And this f dot x cap is basically nothing but the projection of f along the x axis, which is basically nothing but this length. And similarly f dot y cap is essentially nothing but the projection of f along the y axis, so that is basically nothing but this length. So once we have evaluated the projections, we can now express the function f as a linear combination of our basis vectors. Similarly, we can express this f in terms of the coordinates u and v as well, and we can write it down in this format: f dot u cap in the u cap direction plus f dot v cap in the v cap direction. Again, f dot u cap is basically nothing but the projection of f along the u cap axis, and f dot v cap is nothing but the projection of f along the v cap axis. So again, like once we have evaluated the projections, we have expressed the function f as a linear combination of the basis vectors. We are going to use the same idea for our time series representation as well in this Fourier series analysis. So again, what we are going to do is we are going to find out basis functions in our space, in our domain where the function is defined. And once we have the basis functions, we are going to take the projection of our time series function. With these basis functions, we are going to find out the projections. And once we have the projections, we are going to write down our time series function as a linear combination of the basis functions on which the projections were done. So that is what we'll be looking into next. Okay, so similar to the vector decomposition that we did on our previous slide, now we are going to express our function f of t that is defined in the domain minus L comma L as a linear combination of basis functions in that domain. So here the basis functions that we choose are of a sine and cosine nature. So this can actually be proven mathematically that they form the basis functions in that domain. We are not going to get into that. But here what we have essentially done is that we have expressed our function f of t as a linear combination of the cosine terms and sine terms. And there are infinite number of cosine terms and sine terms, in fact, because the summation runs for the values of k from 1 to infinity. And as we change the values of k, what we are essentially doing is that we are changing the frequency of the sine and cosine waves. Now these coefficients that we find a naught, ak and bk, they are nothing but the Fourier coefficients. They are called the Fourier coefficients. And if we look into the definition of ak is it's basically an integral f of t cos k pi t by L dt that runs from minus L to L. So this is basically nothing but the dot product of f of t with the basis function cos k pi t by L. So basically what we are doing is we are trying to project the function f of t on the basis function cos k pi t by L. So basically this is giving the projection. And this factor that we find in the denominator, that is a normalization factor. And we need that because when we did the vector decomposition in the previous slide, we took the projection of f along the unit vectors. We did f dot x cap, we did f dot y cap. So to bring about taking the dot product with the normalized vector, we use this normalization factor here, because here the functions are not normalized, and to normalize it we use this factor. Similarly, bk is basically nothing but the projection of f of t along the basis function sine k pi t by L. And we can also view this a naught value basically as the projection of f of t along the function 1. 1 can be viewed of as a cosine wave with 0 frequency and amplitude of 1. So what we have finally done using this expression is that we have expressed this function f of t as a linear combination of cosine and sine waves, which basically form basis functions in my domain. So in the previous slide we basically expressed this function f of t as a linear combination of sine and cosine waves. But we can always find out other basis functions also, other sets of basis functions inside our domain. And one such commonly used representation is by using this complex exponential terms. So e to the power of I k pi t by L, where k can take values from minus infinity to plus infinity, they also form basis functions in our domain. And we can express this function f of t as a linear combination of these basis functions as well. And using the same analogy, ck, which is basically the coefficient that is associated with the basis function in this summation, is basically nothing but the projection of the function f of t along this basis function. And this is a representation that we will be using as we move on further in this lecture. Now this figure basically shows how good our Fourier series representation is. So the plot in blue here shows the actual function f of t, the time series function, which is there on the left hand side here. And this red curve basically shows our Fourier series approximation. And here the value of n shows the number of terms that are used in the summation. If I say I have a value of n, that basically means that I have only used one term in the summation to represent this function f of t. I have basically truncated this infinite summation to a few number of terms. So we can see that when we use only one term, it's just a sine wave representation and it is not really a good approximation. But as we increase the number of terms, say even if we take only 8 terms, we can see that the Fourier series approximation is fairly representing our time series signal. And if we in fact take the infinite summation, we'll see that it is no longer an approximation and it actually exactly represents the function. So the Fourier series representation, whatever we studied till now, they are valid for continuous functions. However, from our experiments, we don't have continuous functions. Whatever data we get from the sensors or whatever we have extracted out from the images, they are data that have been sampled at discrete intervals of time. So basically we have a discrete time series data. We don't have a continuous data. Now the question is how to do this Fourier transformation or Fourier series representation for this discrete time series data, and that is what we will be looking into now. Say suppose I have a data series, I'm going to represent it in vector format. So say that x is basically my data vector and that x basically has n points. I have n data points in that signal, and xn basically shows the representation of a data point in that signal, where this value of n can take a number anywhere from 0 to n minus 1. So using the same method as what we studied before, so this f of t here, it basically becomes a data vector x. So here xn is expressed as a linear combination of these basis functions, which are of the form e to the power of I 2 pi kn by n. So again, using the same analogy, so xk should correspond to the projection of this data vector x onto my basis function. So again, to calculate the projection, we again take the inner product, and because it is a discrete time series data that I have here, the definition of integral basically reduces to a summation, and here the summation runs from 0 to n minus 1, basically the length of my data vector. And here again I'm taking the dot product of this of my data vector with my basis function, and that basically gives a projection of my data vector onto the basis function. And once I have that, again once I have all the projections estimated, these are essentially the Fourier coefficients that we studied in the continuous functions, for the continuous functions. So once I have this Fourier coefficients or projections estimated, again I can express this f of x, f of t, or basically here my discrete time series data xn, as a linear combination of my basis functions. So that is exactly what we have done here. Now if we look into this definition to estimate the Fourier coefficients or projections, we can actually see that there is a one-to-one map between the data series xn and the projection series capital X. So that basically means that I can express this the projection vector or my Fourier coefficient vector as a matrix multiplication using a matrix multiplication format. So that is what we'll be doing next. So this is the way to express the Fourier coefficient vector in terms of the data vector in the form of matrix multiplication. So this directly comes from the formula that we had presented to estimate these projections, which is basically based on the dot product between the data vector and the basis function. So we can see that this is basically a matrix multiplication with this huge matrix, which is of the order of n cross n, which we are calling as the DFT matrix. Now, if we look into this DFT matrix, we can see that there are only two distinct terms in this DFT matrix. One is 1, the other the constant one. The other is basically omega n, which is e to the power of I 2 pi by n. Now, this is called as the fundamental frequency. And the whole idea behind doing this exercise was that we are finding the projections of our data vector onto these eigenfunctions, onto these basis functions, so that we can get these Fourier coefficients and then express our data series as a linear combination of these basis functions. But to estimate this Fourier coefficients, we see that we need to multiply it with a matrix which is of the order of n cross n. So the number of multiplications that is involved in this operation is of the order of n squared, and where n is basically nothing but the number of points in the data vector. Say if n is equal to 1024, then we'll have to perform 1024 whole square multiplication operations to actually calculate this these Fourier coefficients, and this is computationally very expensive, and that is the reason we use an algorithm, a simpler algorithm, to compute the same thing, which is called as the fast Fourier transform. So we'll look into that next. So FFT is basically a smart way to compute the Fourier coefficients or the projection vector from the DFT matrix and the data vector. So we'll try to understand this. This is just I'm just giving an overview of the FFT method here. We are not going much into the details, and we'll try to understand this by using an example. So suppose I have a data signal that has 16 points. I have 16 discrete data points. So we can now split this data signal into odd and even terms, each containing 8 terms. So basically what we have done here is that we have rearranged this x vector into odd terms and even terms. Once we rearrange the data vector, we even need to rearrange the DFT vector, DFT matrix. And once we rearrange, we find something very interesting. We see that this DFT matrix can now be expressed as a product of two other matrices. And these matrices contains terms such as I8, D8, F8. I8 is basically nothing but an identity matrix which is of the order of 8 cross 8. D8 is a diagonal matrix which is of the order of 8 cross 8, and I have shown the diagonal matrix here. And these diagonal matrix only contain terms such as 1 and omega n. And F8 is a DFT matrix, but this time it is of the order of 8 cross 8. So what we have done using this technique is that we have essentially been able to express F16 in terms of F8 and other diagonal matrices. And one important thing to note is that computing multiplication with diagonal matrices require less number of steps. And also we have reduced the order of the DFT matrix. And now we can do this process in an iterative fashion. We can further split the odd and even subsets that we had created into odd and even categories in their own subsets, like the way that we see here. And once we do that, we can see that we can basically express the F8 matrix, the DFT matrix of the order of 8 cross 8. It can now be expressed in terms of a DFT matrix which is of the order of 4 cross 4, an F4 matrix. And further splitting, you can show that it can be expressed in terms of F2, which is a DFT matrix of the order of 2 cross 2. And now what we have essentially done is that we have now been able to express our main DFT matrix into an 2 cross 2 DFT matrix and other diagonal and other matrices that are of diagonal format, diagonal matrices basically. And we can mathematically show that the number of multiplication operations that is actually needed to compute the projection vector using this method, using this iteratively reducing the order of the DFT matrix, is of the order of n log n, and that is significantly lower than the number of steps that are actually involved in computing the projection vector using the multiplication operation with directly the DFT matrix and the data vector, which was of the order of n square that we saw before. So that is basically what FFT does. FFT basically computes the projection vector from the DFT matrix and the data vector in a very smart way, in a very smart and efficient way. Uh, so now we'll look into a MATLAB tutorial where we'll use FFT to process our experimental signal, to reconstruct the signal in terms of basis functions, and then we'll also try to use this FFT data to filter out the noise from our experimental signal.